All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something that might surprise you, wet fowl pox. Now, you sent over some serious research on this, and I gotta say, color me intrigued. From what I'm seeing, this isn't just a simple bird flu, it's a whole different beast.
Yeah, you could say that. It's way bigger than just a few sick chickens in the backyard. We're talking wet fowl pox, a global problem, and it can really decimate bird populations, especially chickens. And just to be clear, it's not like your typical bird flu. Those are usually RNA viruses. This one's a DNA virus.
A DNA virus, huh? So we're not just talking about a few sniffly birds here. This thing's got some serious reach. What makes it so contagious?
It spreads like crazy through a flock, and the main culprits are those biting insects. Mosquitoes, mites, they're not just annoying, they're like tiny little flying syringes, spreading that virus wherever they go.
Okay, that's both fascinating and kind of creepy. I can see why you said this is a global issue. It's like a microscopic horror movie unfolding right in front of us.
Right.
But if insects are the main spreader, what about, bird-to-bird contact? Does that play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Direct contact's a big one. And just like with other contagious things, any surface can be contaminated. Feeders, the water, even the coop itself, everything can become a breeding ground for the virus.
So early detection seems pretty critical here. What should we be looking for? What are the telltale signs that wet fowl pox has moved into a flock?
Well, this is where things get a little CSI. One of the most obvious signs is, well, it's kind of gross. You get these yellowish, cheesy-looking plaques, usually in the mouth and throat. And those plaques, they're basically masses of dead tissue, inflammatory cells, and of course, viral particles.
Cheesy plaques, yikes. That doesn't sound pleasant at all. I bet that makes it hard to eat and breathe.
You got it. Those plaques make it incredibly difficult for the birds to eat, to breathe, so they start losing weight, they're lethargic, weak. And to top it off, they often develop respiratory problems like, nasal discharge, coughing, anything that shows there's inflammation in their respiratory tract.
So those plaques are a double whammy then, messing with their eating and breathing. This is painting a pretty bleak picture. Just how serious are we talking here? Is this just a minor inconvenience, or could these birds actually die from this?
It can be really, really serious. I mean, mortality rates in unvaccinated adult birds, they can hit 50%. That's half a flock potentially wiped out.
50%? Whoa, that's a lot higher than I was expecting. What makes it so deadly?
Well, the breathing problems alone can be fatal, but a lot of times it's those secondary infections that finish the job. You see, the bird's immune system is already weakened fighting the virus, so it's easy for bacteria to take hold. And obviously, chicks and any birds that are already sick are going to be hit even harder.
Okay, so we've got a stealthy virus, some pretty nasty symptoms, and a potentially devastating impact. This is serious stuff. So knowing all this, what can we do to fight back against this poultry plague? Is there any hope for these birds?
There's definitely hope. We're not helpless against this thing. We've got some pretty good tools to fight back, and vaccination's at the top of that list. It's our first and best defense, really. Think of it as like giving their immune systems a preview, so they're ready when the real virus shows up.
So vaccination is like a training program for their immune system. I like that analogy. Tell me more about how it actually works.
It's pretty cool, really. Most vaccines, they use a weakened version of the virus or sometimes even a dead one. The idea is to trigger that antibody production without actually getting the bird sick. So that way, if they encounter the real deal later on, their system's ready to fight.
That makes sense. But there are different types of vaccines out there, right? Like, how do we know which one's the best for our feathered friends?
Right, there are different approaches. For wet fowl-pox, you usually see those live attenuated vaccines, and then you've got the inactivated ones. Live attenuated, those use a weakened form, while inactivated, those use a killed version. Both work, but those live ones tend to give longer-lasting immunity.
So live attenuated is like boot camp. Activated is more like a classroom lecture.
Right.
Both have their place, but boot camp gives you that tougher protection, huh? But timing must be super important here.
Oh, absolutely. We got to get the timing right. Usually you vaccinate chicks when they're young before they're exposed to the environment. And any new birds joining a flock, you got to vaccinate them before they're mixed in with the others.
Sounds like a lot of strategy involved in keeping these birds safe. What about the environment itself? Can we do anything to reduce the risk in their surroundings?
Yeah, that's where biosecurity comes in. It's all about breaking the chain of infection, making that environment as hostile to the virus as we can. Like the microscopic game of keep away, right?
Keep away, I like that. What kind of strategies are we talking about here?
We got to hit it from multiple angles. Controlling those insects is huge. Insecticides, netting, those can be really helpful. And no standing water, that's where those mosquitoes breed. And then, of course, keeping everything clean. I mean really clean. You're disinfecting the feeders, the waterers, the coop itself, all those potential virus hideouts.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. Insect control, eliminating breeding grounds, and keeping everything super clean. We're basically building a fortress for these birds. But even with all that, some birds might still get sick, right? What do we do then?
Yeah, sometimes that virus just slips through. That's where supportive care comes in. Now, there's no magic cure for the virus itself, but we can still do a lot to help those infected birds fight back and recover.
Give me the rundown. What kind of supportive care are we talking about?
You got to create that healing environment. Clean water, fresh water all the time. The diet needs to be top-notch, packed with nutrients, lots of vitamins, minerals. And this is important. Got to minimize stress. Stress messes with their immune system, so a calm environment is key.
So we're treating the whole bird, not just the disease. Makes sense. What about antibiotics? Do they play a role here?
Absolutely. Antibiotics are key for managing those secondary bacterial infections. Those can be just as bad as the virus itself. Now remember, antibiotics, they don't work directly on viruses, so they won't cure wet Fowlpox itself. But they can be lifesavers when it comes to preventing or treating those bacterial infections.
So supportive care is all about giving those birds the best chance to fight back and recover.
Got it. Thinking long-term, though, what are the lasting implications for birds that have been infected?
Well, recovery from wet Fowlpox, it can be slow. It takes weeks sometimes for them to fully bounce back, even after the symptoms are gone. And even then, those secondary infections can still pop up.
So even when they seem better, we still got to keep an eye on them.
Yeah.
What about the bird's overall health in the long run? Are there any lingering effects? Yeah, sometimes. Some birds, especially those that got hit hard, they might have breathing problems that stick around. And even if the whole flock seems recovered, the virus can reemerge, especially if those biosecurity measures aren't kept up.
Like a dragon waiting to come back to life, huh?
Mm.
Sounds like we got to be proactive even after an outbreak seems to be under control.
You got it. This virus has been around for a long time, and it's really good at adapting. We got to be just as persistent in our efforts to control it to prevent it from spreading.
You mentioned it's been around for a while. How long has this been a problem, this wet Fowlpox?
Centuries, actually. Outbreaks were recorded way back in the 18th century, long before we even knew what viruses were.
Wow, that's a long time to be causing trouble for farmers. Makes you wonder how they even figured out what it was back then. No fancy tests or anything.
It's pretty amazing, right? They were able to recognize the patterns, come up with strategies to manage it, all without really knowing what was causing it. It wasn't until much later that we figured out it was this Pox virus.
Talk about detective work. So given its long history and all the challenges, what's the situation like globally with wet Fowlpox?
It's still a major concern. The poultry trade is global, so the virus can spread across borders really easily. It's a worldwide problem.
It's like a global game of whack-a-mole. So that means sharing information, sharing strategies, that must be crucial, right?
Absolutely. We need a coordinated effort worldwide. Sharing research, sharing what works, keeping track of outbreaks, that's how we stay ahead of this thing.
Speaking of research, what are scientists focusing on right now in the fight against this virus?
Lots of things. One of the most promising areas is new vaccines. Vaccines that last longer, easier to give, that would be a game changer.
That would be huge. What about biosecurity? Any new developments there?
Oh yeah, they're constantly working on that. New types of insecticides that are more targeted, less harmful to the environment, and better ways to disinfect things. Plus, they're working on early detection and faster response to outbreaks.
It sounds like they're really covering all the bases. So how much do we actually know about this virus? Are there still things we're trying to figure out?
Tons. We're learning more all the time. They're really digging into its genes, its DNA, trying to understand how it causes disease, how it spreads, and how it might change.
It's like they're trying to read the virus's mind, huh? That genetic research must be really important for coming up with better strategies.
Exactly. By figuring out its genetic code, we can develop better diagnostic tools, more effective vaccines, and more targeted biosecurity measures. It's all about staying one step ahead.
So the fight continues. Researchers, vets, farmers, all working together to protect poultry and minimize the impact of this disease.
It's really impressive the amount of effort and collaboration going on. Gives you hope that we can eventually win this battle.
This has been fascinating. We've gone from cheesy plaques to global pandemics, microscopic viruses to entire ecosystems. Amazing how much we've learned about this disease.
It's the power of curiosity, right? You never know what you'll discover when you take a deep dive into these things.
You've been an awesome guide on this journey. Thanks for sharing your expertise.
It's been my pleasure. Always love talking about the amazing world of viruses.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about poultry diseases and their impact on animal and human health. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From those cheesy plaques to global outbreaks, the whole 9 yards. But before we wrap up this deep dive into wet fowlpox, there's something you mentioned earlier that I wanted to circle back to. You said this whole thing has implications beyond just, the chicken coop. What did you mean by that?
Right. Well, chickens and domesticated birds, they're definitely the main targets of this virus, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it, about the potential impact on other species, especially those wild birds.
So wild birds could be at risk too. I guess that makes sense. They share habitats, resources, all that. What are the chances of this thing spreading from, poultry to wild birds?
It's definitely a concern. We don't know the full impact on wild bird populations yet, but it's something we need to look into more.
Hmm.
Imagine, wild birds foraging near a poultry farm. They come into contact with the virus. The consequences, especially for vulnerable species, could be really significant.
It really shows how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? You think it's just a chicken disease, but it could ripple through the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. We can't look at these things in isolation. We need to think about disease prevention and management in a way that considers the whole ecosystem, the balance of it all.
Now, you also hinted at a human connection, and the big question is, should we be worried about this thing, jumping to humans? We've all seen what can happen when a virus crosses species.
Yeah, that's on everyone's mind these days. But, and this is the good news, wet fowlpox isn't considered a direct threat to us. It's really adapted to birds, and there's no evidence that it can infect humans.
Okay, that's good to hear. But why not? I mean, if it can go from chickens to wild birds, why not to us?
Well, it comes down to how viruses work. They use these things called receptors to get into cells to infect them. It's like a key fitting into a lock. Our cells just don't have the right locks for this virus. Imagine trying to open your front door with your car key. It just won't work.
So we can breathe a sigh of relief. Wet fowlpox isn't going to be the next pandemic movie plot. But, I mean, does that mean we can completely ignore it when it comes to human health?
Not exactly. Wet fowlpox might not be a direct threat itself, but it's a reminder. Viruses, they're always changing, adapting, evolving, and there's always that chance, even if it's small, that a virus could evolve to infect a new host.
So it's a cautionary tale,
Yeah.
reminding us to stay vigilant, right? We can't let our guard down when it comes to these new diseases popping up.
Exactly. We need to
Yeah.
keep researching, keep monitoring these viruses, stay ahead of the game. Knowledge is our best weapon.
Makes you appreciate those researchers out there on the front lines. They're the real heroes in all of this.
Couldn't agree more. They're doing incredibly important work to protect both animals and humans.
This has been an amazing journey. We started with cheesy plaques and ended up talking about global pandemics and the future of viruses. I'm blown away by how much we've learned about this, often overlooked disease.
Well, it's all thanks to your curiosity, you asking the right questions. It's amazing what you can discover when you take a deep dive into these things.
Well, you've been a fantastic guide. Thanks for sharing your expertise with me and our listener.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about the fascinating world of viruses.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about the hidden world of poultry diseases and, what it all means for both animals and humans. Stay curious, keep learning, and as always, stay healthy.